Good afternoon from the Gothenburg Learning Center. My name is Sean McDonald, one of the trainees here. Today I just want to take a little bit of break from harvest and go over something really special and dear to me, being the history of corn, just going from where it started out at to what we have here in the modern day. As you'll see over time, just the advances and the leaps in technology and developments of breeding and agronomics, and just how much it's taken to improve yields, disease tolerance, every characteristic we care about today. There's very interesting history that goes along with it, and I hope to share with a little bit about it today.
To start our journey, we need to talk about this little grass right here. If you can see it, reminds you maybe some ornamental grass you might be growing on your lawn or garden. But it has a few characteristics like you think about with corn. Look at those tassels, very similar to corn. A few other features, leaves, stalks, kind of reminds you of corn in a sense. But very much has those ornamental kind of grassy-like features. Well, if we did have a few ears here, and with some of these frosts, we sadly are probably not going to get any ears this year, you'll see it has a very rock-hard kind of kernel. Very unappetizing, nothing you'd think about eating. Well, what's believed here is this plant right here called teosinte, like I said, from south central regions of Mexico, is where we think of all modern day corn today. So if we look at that seed specifically, it stores incredibly well. And if you put it in fire, you'll actually find it'll pop just like popcorn and has a very high starch content. So a great energy source for those long winter months, droughts, things like that, where food maybe wasn't as easy to access. Well, progressive breeding over time brought, bringing in new traits, better types of corn that were either a little better harvestability, didn't fall on the ground, things like that are all what led up to modern day corn. But it all starts from here, from this one simple grass.
Another interesting step on this journey is a plant we don't typically or really hear about, and this is actually a plant, as you'll see, has a really interesting looking tassel to it, some really interesting stock characteristics, very different, different pigmentations, a lot of these purples, which is not something you really see in a lot of corns today, but in a lot of these really old type inbreds and varieties of corn, you will see a lot of interesting characteristics. In this case, we have pod corn here. So this is just, you pull it off, there's a regular husk, kind of like, think, oh, that's just any regular ear. But it has a very interesting characteristic where these glooms, a lot of people would say bees' wings, totally encompass each and every one of these kernels. So if we were to tear these apart, there would be a little kernel inside each and every one. So when we look at here, these are extraordinarily old genetics. One of those kind of maybe first steps as we get maybe towards something what we think about more of like a modern day corn. So one of the interesting things when you really, think about corn is you typically think of, yellow, maybe white, bicolored for some sweet corns, and maybe blue corn, I think blue corn tortilla chips or something like that in there. But there's a lot of other interesting colors when it comes to corn. You'll see a lot of interesting colors like reds, greens, blues, and in a lot of cases, a very old coloration is more in the form of purples. So this here is we have an old variety called Hopi Purple. You can even see one of our little friends here, a little corn earworm. But just goes to show you just how vast and wide of different colorations, different characteristics that do exist in the corn germplasm. Before we get on to our next step in the journey, I think it's very important to talk about the different types of corn that we see. So you might think of, this is probably the first thing that comes to your mind. That's probably the first thing that comes to my mind when it comes to corn. This is very typical of modern day yellow dent corn. So it's why it's called dent. Well, obviously yellow for one thing, but dent corn, if you look closely, there's a little dent in every kernel there. So it's a fairly, yellow dent, as you'll see, is actually a fairly modern invention. If you go back, whether it be, pre-colonial days, colonial days, all the way up in the 1800s, what they think of more of as a common type of corn they would see is what we call flint corn. So flint corn, if you think of flint, flint's very hard. So that's what flint corn is. It has a very hard kernel, great for milling, those kind of things. And that's kind of what we think of as, those pre-colonial, colonial, all the way up in the 1800s type of corn, very common to grow. Besides yellow dent corn, there's also this right here, which we'll get into. This one's actually what's called gourd seed dent. So it's a little bit different of a kernel type characteristic, a little more pointed. It's actually a very soft type of kernel. They actually told me this back in the day was actually probably makes some of the greatest cornbread you'll ever have. But there's it's a dent corn, so there is just a slight bit of dent. in each and every one of those kernels. Other corns you might know about and what we don't have here today, things like popcorn, which has more similar characteristics to a flint corn, having a very hard kernel to it. Things like pod corn, as we saw earlier, having those glooms and those husks fully encompass each and every kernel. And sweet corns. If you ever look at, planting your own sweet corn, you'll see these dry, kind of shriveled up little kernels there, meaning they have a much kind of less starch development, much more sweeter. So you have much more breakdown of the sugars there, which causes that shrunkenness to each and every kernel. So it might be hard to believe, but this right here is actually a very important kind of family photo when it comes to the history of what we think of as modern day corn, right here. So this right here on the left is what we call Cherokee gourd seed. In the middle we have what we call here Longfellow flint. So for this to exist, these two crossed together by accident. There's a guy named Robert Reed back in the 1840s. He originally had planted this, but it had a very poor germ to it. This is very late season corn. Back in the day, people used to carry over a lot of seed into the next year. He harvested this a little too soon. In the prior year, the seed quality wasn't very great to it, and before he planted it, it didn't really germinate very well. Well, the problem with this is a very long season kind of corn. 130 day relative maturity. If you know what that means, it takes about 130 days from planting the ground all the way to blackware, or what we call physiological maturity. So to suffice, he wanted at least a good corn crop, so he put in this, what we call Longfellow flint, or a type of other flint corn, which has a much shorter season growing from seed all the way to physiological maturity. Well, what he found at the end of the year is carrying over that seed, some of these had cross-hybridized together and created what we think of as modern day yellow dent corn in the form of Reed's yellow dent, as we'll see a bit later. In the case of coming back here, this right here is Reed yellow dent. So looking at it, it looks just like what we think of as yellow corn. You might think this would be grown today. But this is a very, very, very old type of corn, all the way, like I said before, all the way back to the 1840s. So you can see in this instance here, disease issues, insect issues were very prevalent back then. If you're looking at the plant, produces a nice tall plant, granted frosted over, so they don't look as pretty as they used to. But I also planted these at a fairly low population, and so they had a lot of energy to really grow nice and big and tall. But more characteristic of what we think of as yellow corn. Fun thing we've found here though is that this low population, really treating it kind of right with drip zone, a little bit of nitrogen here and there, it can produce some very, very nice ears. So besides Reed's accidental cross back in the 1840s, there's a lot of other interesting genetics that come rise around kind of the mid 1800s. In the case here, we have this really tall corn called Lancaster Surecrop, which comes all the way just right after the Civil War, maybe slightly during the Civil War, right out of Lancaster County in Pennsylvania. So one of the interesting things here is just how long of an ear it puts on. I think some of the ones we found are probably all the way around 14 inches in length, which for a corn ear is massive. But one of the interesting things about these is, they might be well over 100+ years old, but a lot of these genetic backgrounds still exist in our modern day corns today, accounting for a couple percent here or there of every modern corn you see today. The corn you eat, the corn that gets fed to livestock, it's all there in some of these old genetics. So besides just, the interesting yield qualities we see out of the advent of Reed's yellow dent Lancaster Surecrop, this hybrid right here, just looks like any normal corn as you see back from the 1800s. This actually is hiding a very interesting feature to it. In the case of this right here, this produces this beautiful, beautiful red ear. It's called Bloody Butcher. So, you look at that, kernel quality, like, wow, that just looks pretty, maybe kind of ornamental. This actually is very famous for being a great silage hybrid back all the way in the late 1800s, all the way up into the early 1900s. So besides just, that beautiful color quality, we look for a lot of other qualities when it comes to corn. The silage, plant matter, feeding the livestock is very important to U.S. agriculture. And this is one of the major steps that come along with it, as well as being a very important background when it comes to modern day corns. This right here is a very interesting time point, right around the 1930s, 1920s. And this is the advent of hybrid corn. So before about the 1930s, hybrid corn really didn't exist in a large capacity. For one, it takes a lot of effort to go and breed, manually crossing plant to plant. If any of you might know from your childhoods about detasseling corn here or there, getting rid of those male tassels, get rid of that pollen source, so that you're forcing a specific cross. Well, that takes a lot of effort, but there's a lot of great benefits you get out of hybrid corn, whether it be the increase of what we call hybrid vigor, which we get better plant health, better yield characteristics, better disease characteristics, all important things. Well, it really wasn't until about the 1930s where hybrid corn really started to take off. So if you talk to a farmer or seed dealer today, they'll always be talking about corn hybrids. Well, what is a hybrid? Well, you're a hybrid, for instance. You're the offspring of your mom and your dad, two unlike people. Same thing for corn. Well, if you remember, for anybody who detasseled back in the day, you took off that tassel or that male pollen source to really force, specific crosses of specific lines of corn. Well, not until about the 1930s did that really ever take off. Hybrid corn takes a lot of time and effort, and it's really not until that time period, maybe around the 20s, 30s, 40s, where seed companies start to take off, where they're really driving a lot of force and effort into creating hybrid corn and taking time with farmers to see that there's a lot of benefit to their operation to growing it. So in the case here, there's a lot of interesting things, especially here. Didn't have the best seed quality in the world, but this right here is called XL45A. Probably one of the most famous corn hybrids from DeKalb. Here we're moving from the past to the modern day. What I'd say with these is more like the biotech age. So opening up the germplasm to new traits, which likely would never have existed without it. In the case of better management of weeds through herbicide resistance traits, better management of insects that still rob yield today, such as corn borer, as well as looking at traits beyond that, managing in tougher situations like drought. And then looking at maybe the future. In the case of short stature corn, where and when that'll take us, and some of the interesting characteristics that you get by moving the plant a little shorter to the ground. So as we can see in this little history lesson, that's about 7,000 years just worth of corn development. And it goes to show just how important corn has been to producing the food, fiber, and fuel, which we all depend on, even in those ancient days. So there's a lot of great resources out there, a lot of great books, a lot of great papers, which I can point you to if you're curious. But that's all we had for you today from the Learning Center. Come back for another video.